So the committee was formed about a year ago. The selectmen appointed us to engage in a master planning process for the state hospital now that the town owns the property. So here's the mission statement that the selectmen gave to us to guide us in doing our planning process. There was a little tweak to this mission statement, and that is the selectmen asked us also to look at some of the surrounding town-owned properties that were in the vicinity of the hospital, like McCarthy Park and the Hinckley property and Lot 3 Ice House Lane. So when you look at some of the maps around here, you'll see that those properties are also denoted as part of our subject. So the mission's a little broader than just the state hospital property. So keep that in mind as you go through the process tonight. So the committee's first decision was to try to hire a consultant to help us in engaging in this process, because although we did some visioning process that we explained at town meeting when we voted to acquire the property, we felt like we wanted to broaden the participation in town to really try to develop a plan that would be a consensus in town that would pass town meeting, because anything we do as far as rezoning has to get a 2/3 vote at town meeting. So for us, it's really important that we get buy-in from the residents and come up with a plan that really reflects the town's wishes with respect to the property. So that's why we're engaging in this process, why we're really happy to have you all here. And I'm going to turn it over to our I'm going to turn over to Randy next, but I also wanted to introduce our consultants. So we went out with an RFP for consultants to help us in this process. We chose VHB, Vanessa Hang and Bruslin, and we have 4 members from the VHB team. Jeffrey Morrison Logan, who's sort of our project manager here in the front row. Craig Seymour is with RKG. He's the financial guy who's on the team. Ken Schwartz, also here in the front row. And Rita Walsh. Rita is in the back there, so just raised her hand. So they're the members of VHB who are here tonight to help us in this process. So with that, I will turn it over to Randy Carg, who with Teresa James has been really instrumental in organizing this evening. So Randy, take it away.
What I'd like to do is start off with an explanation of what we're trying to do here in 3 simple bullet points. There is a poster board back there that has an expansion of the objectives for this project. But primarily we want to start off by preserving the character of the town of Medfield. And there's a lot of things that make Medfield Medfield. You know, it's a largely rural town with a lot of open space, populated by people who value education, sports and recreation, arts and culture, and the history that we have here in this town. There's very few towns of our size that has its own town historian. And fundamentally, we want to try and put together plans that preserve the nature and the character of the town of Medfield. The second objective is around the housing inventory. Our housing inventory now is heavily weighted towards single-family homes that are high in value. And while that's a wonderful place to live for many people, there are parts of the real estate market that we don't address with our current inventory, and that's one of the things we want to take a look at. Whether it is smaller homes that are appropriate for people just starting out their independent life, or for people at the other end of the age spectrum who are looking for a place which is smaller and has a floor plan that's amenable for people that have a few years on their body. And then there's another issue. We've got a 600-pound gorilla in the corner, which we continuously ignore but refuses to go away, and that's the affordable housing mandates that are driven by the Section 40B in the state code. So those are all issues that we want to look at from a housing standpoint. Ultimately, from an economic and financial point of view, we want to make sure that plans that we put in place represent a fair value for the citizens of Medfield, whether that's financial return for an investment or whether that's value in open space, arts and culture, or things which are difficult to quantify with money but provide value and perceived attractiveness for the people in the town who have to pay the bills. As I said, there's an expansion of this in the chart there by the doorway if you'd like to look at some of the other issues that have come up. But in general, what we're trying to do is to balance out those issues. We're going to move with due deliberation and speed. The end point here is to have a presentation at a town meeting next spring for the zoning changes that would be necessary for whatever plan we develop as part of this process. So at the beginning of this, we've got a meeting tonight where we'd like to get your input and provide what we call shaping for a variety of scenarios that we'll be analyzing and coming back with another public meeting to share with the public sometime in early September. With feedback from that meeting, we'll develop an ultimate proposal that will be taken to the various boards in the town for approval, and then ultimately to a town meeting, as Steve pointed out, with a fairly high threshold for approval. It's a 2/3 majority required to move forward. So we really appreciate having all of you participate in the front end of this process, because it's very helpful to get input up front to help us shape the four scenarios that we'll be looking at, including a base case. Pictorially, this is what our challenge looks like. If you look at a space that's bounded by housing needs, retaining the character of the town of Medfield, and taxpayers' willingness to pay, and then overlay on that all the stakeholders, people that need to be on board and aligned with where we're going, and that includes things like the town's taxpayers, the town's boards, the service providers, the schools, the Department of Public Works, city services, the Historic Commission. This land is on, I think, every historic register that exists in the United States, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be satisfied, and I've only put 5 in here because I ran out of room. I have one for advocacy groups. We have strong advocacy groups for sports, recreation, open land, historical preservation, arts and culture. There's a lot of vibrancy in this town, and what we're trying to do with this process is to find that small space in the center, bounded by our values, economic reality, housing needs, and all of the stakeholders' needs, where everybody can be satisfied. So I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts for tonight. Emerson said in the 19th century that nothing astonishes people so much as common sense and plain dealing. As we're talking with one another, with your friends and neighbors at the breakout sessions tonight, I'd encourage you to keep a couple things in mind. Number one, assume good intent. People come to this meeting with different points of view, different backgrounds and interests, but I think everybody's here tonight because they honestly want to do what's best for the town of Medfield. So assume good intent. Say what you mean what you say, and listen as an ally. And I think if we do that, we'll be able to conduct this meeting in the spirit of Emerson and astonish ourselves. Thank you once again for coming out on this rather warm night. I'm going to turn it over now to Jeffrey Morrison Logan.
Excellent. Thank you, Randy. I can't tell you how excited we are to be here tonight as a consultant team. When we first read the RFP that the town issued months ago now, and getting ready for tonight, it was such an exciting opportunity for us to get involved with the town that we said right away, boy, we'd love to go after this project, have the opportunity to work with the town. Because if you think about properties like the Medfield State Hospital site, it is such a unique opportunity, I would argue throughout the state, I would argue throughout New England, and perhaps beyond, where a community has the chance not only to purchase such a premier piece of property, but to be able to work in a close-knit way, and all the things that Randy mentioned about building a vision around what you want to do for your next generation, at the same time respecting some of the legacies and how the land grew up over time. So this is the stuff that we love doing, and we're really excited to be here tonight to share that planning process with you over the next year. We're super excited about that. So in planning for tonight, part of what we wanted to do is actually put you to work a lot tonight. As much as the town has done a tremendous amount of work over the last 2 years, building a lot of studies and putting a lot of thought into it that led up towards tonight, there's still actually a fair amount of homework to do to get you all in a place where you're ready to start that next chapter and to see a redevelopment happen on that site and do the things that you want to do with that site. So tonight is really set up to achieve a lot of goals around that front. So what I'll do is I'll spend probably next 20 minutes or so talking a little bit about, from what I call these different perspectives or these different frameworks that we think it's important for you to be thinking about how the site might evolve over time. Because I think it's through balancing these different perspectives and these different frameworks that ultimately lead towards success and balance in achieving your goals. And then what we want to do is share with you what's called a baseline, not a baseline really, a non-development scenario, which looks at some of the financial aspects of the site, because we also think it's important at this point in the stage of the planning process to think about some of the financials, about the costs, the benefits, who's going to pay for what, how are you going to structure those types of things. So as you go from visioning at a 50,000 foot level down to a 30, down to a 10, and down to really feet on the ground on the site, how do you start to think about economics, market, financing, and all of the dollars and the cents to go into it? So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, again, to arm you with more information. And then I think we'll have a lot of fun tonight through these, we call these electronic clickers that Randy mentioned here. Through a lot of the public outreach process that we do, we always find that these are a lot of fun to engage the community. What we've done is we put together a visual preference survey so that you can learn, so that we can learn about things that you like, and more importantly, things that you don't like, or that maybe you're neutral on as you're thinking about what the vision for the site might be here as well. So it's our hope that by 7:45, 7:50 tonight, you'll have a lot of more information. You can be armed with a lot more things, and then we're going to divide you up into these breakout sessions, put you to work drawing things, writing down your wish list items, and building those ideas. Come back to us in the sit-down format, present to us for a few minutes, and then over the summer, we're going to do our hard work in preparing some alternatives for you. So a little bit about the project. So we structured the evening tonight intentionally with this open house, with the idea that you can learn a lot about these different topic areas, and hopefully you found that very informative, especially the did you know information that's at each of these stations, because there's a lot of great information and tidbits that are out there that are very helpful in that process. But also just to understand a little bit more about kind of what's in this project, what's outside of this project. So what you have in front of you here is a map that shows you where the different properties are that the town was able to acquire from the state. Down towards the bottom, there's the town center here in downtown Medfield. Up towards the state hospital site, which is in this site up in here, is the largest core campus. But you'll also notice that there are 3 or 4 other parcels that are out in that area that are beyond that. You'll also notice in this map that this site affords great access over towards Route 27, that's to the west. A little bit further afield from Route 109, Main Street, that's down towards the south in the heart of downtown. And it's next to Hospital Road and some of the more suburban residential pockets of your community. So it's an interesting location for this site, as well as where you're at the town border near Sherborne and Dover and the Charles River up to the north. So knowing who your neighbors are, knowing the context of the site, really starts to impact or influence what you might be able to do with the site over time. Over time. It's not in the downtown. It's not next to major highways. So those things make this site very unique. So when you zoom in a little bit closer and you think about the individual parcels that are there, there's actually 4 or 5 parcels. The parcel to the north here, this is parcel A. That's really where the core campus is of all of the historic hospital buildings, the roads, the infrastructure, and so forth that's out there today. As you go across Hospital Road, there's the Sledding Hills property in here. And as you go further southeast, there's the McCarthy Fields, where they have the recreation fields, the ball fields. Hopefully you all had a chance to tour that wonderful resource the town has. And also included in the study is further to the south, there's a property called Lot 3 and the Hinckley property. And the town had the foresight to think about this planning process by incorporating all of those sites so that you're planning in a very holistic manner and incorporating all of those as you're thinking about the future. And then the sites that are in the yellow are properties that are still owned by the state. So it's also important to understand who your immediate abutters are and that the state owns those properties and parcels to the east and to the west. And again, what I found very interesting about this particular site is that it has this unique history that goes over 100 years ago when this property got built as the state hospital as you've known it today. And it was planned as a campus, if you will, that had a series of buildings that wrapped either side of a core part to the campus. In the middle of that campus was the chapel building. That was really one of the most iconic buildings in the middle of the campus, as well as the administration building that's out towards Hospital Road. And the flanking either sides of that campus is where the men and where the women were housed on the campus here over time. So it's actually a pretty interesting development pattern, if you will, of how this property was conceived 100 years ago. When you go out on site today, and it's an amazing site today so far as how big it is, how the buildings and the architecture have such a dominant feel to the site today. But some of the panoramic photos here show you how large the campus is, how big some of these spaces are, and how the buildings contribute to the layout and how you understand the scale and the character and the texture of those spaces. And as you notice, many of these buildings are boarded up today. The windows are gone. Many of them are in states of disrepair. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But it's a very unique opportunity and very unique character and history to this site. So a little bit about, I think, what will help you as you're going to the breakout sessions tonight is about what goes into some of these master plan alternatives. We're not going to be designing every square foot and every square inch of these buildings as a planning process. That's actually not helpful to what you need to do in your next steps as a town and a community. This is what's called a master plan level of effort. It's really in that higher level of understanding broad land uses, mixes and overall quantities of spaces, how you might set up the site in a series of phases as it develops over time. So these next few slides hopefully will give you some of the insight about what are those key elements that go into creating these alternatives that we'll be doing with you over the summer. It starts, as I mentioned, with recognizing the work that the town has done over the last few years with the stacks of reports that we've received. Sometimes we don't get those when we start a planning process, so the town is in very good shape with all of the homework that you've done, with inventories, assessments, and so forth, that tells us a lot about the status of what you have out there from infrastructure, buildings, environmental conditions. That's great legwork that the town has done. But also from cues from prior master plans that have been done by the town. And there are several that are out there. The most recent one dates back to February of last year, and maybe some of you were involved in that planning process over a workshop that happened over the course of a day that led to some land use ideas, some plans that indicated maybe some different ways of utilizing the site, with maybe some retail on the site, for example, that's in that orange color. Some community buildings that are in the dark red color that's up there. Maybe some single-family housing in the yellow color that's up there. Maybe some senior housing in the purple color. And the green is really about preservation of land and open space and things. So some initial thinking, probably at that 50,000-foot level, are some key indicators for us today. And tonight, we're going to test some of this and think if there are other alternatives that the town should be exploring that might look different from what you see up here as well. Some of the other considerations are on the environmental side, and a significant amount of environmental investigation work has already happened, is underway, and things are starting to be cleaned up to the extent that many of those issues are already taken care of. That's good news for the town. There's one remaining outstanding issue that's actively being resolved in the kind of northwest quadrant of the site where the old laundry facilities were on the hospital. That's actively being taken care of as an outstanding issue on parcels A and A1, which is next to where the core campus site is. So that's good news. There's ongoing monitoring of that area and treatments and special programs that are in place and a whole public involvement plan in place. So the good news here is that you're not starting from scratch. The good news is that there are plans in place. And the good news is that there's ways that you can move into that next chapter and start thinking about development sooner rather than later. A different perspective, and hopefully you saw this at the open land and the natural environment station that we had over here to my left. There's a lot of great documentation both from the town and from the state that identify those key open space and natural resources, and there's many of them on the site here. Wetlands, especially along where the Charles River is and some of the low-lying areas of the property, those are resources that are protected by the state and by the town that limit what you can and cannot do around those areas, as well as buffers that extend from those core areas. The Charles River front, talk about an amazing view down to the riverfront that it has here, the canoeing and the kayaking and the canoe launch that's being built out there today, an amazing resource. But those areas too are protected with riverfront rules and regulations. Knowing that part of the site is in a floodplain based on where the river goes by there is an important thing to react to, making sure you're not putting buildings and resources in those places. There's an underground aquifer that goes through parts of the site here, and then also that the natural part of the site through the species and the plants and the wildlife that's out there is very unique. And if you can look closely at all those areas in the yellow that show up there, this is prime agricultural land. And if you think back to how the hospital was used 100 years ago, they had active farming as part of the treatments in the hospital program, where people were actively using the land as agriculture features. So a lot of great natural resources to your site. So think about those. What are those attributes that you want to make sure live on to the next generation? How can we use those in the alternatives and recognize them as amenities, not as necessary constraints or as barriers to what you want to have moving forward? And in the vision plan report that happened a year ago, a lot of great ideas came out from that plan about using it for open space recreation, continuing with the sledding hill, fields, indoor facilities and programs for recreation and so forth. So land is a tremendous amenity for the town here. From the built environment, so switching hats, thinking about not the natural side, but more the built side of the environment. And as I mentioned, the buildings that are out there today have a lot of unique character, qualities, history to them. Most of them are brick buildings out there, with the exception of some of the smaller buildings to the southeast of the site. So those are cues for us about where those buildings are placed on the site. Might that shape where development could happen over time or not? What happens if they stay? What happens if they go? That will start to influence how alternatives might have to place buildings that are future buildings in certain places, or have the freedom to move them around. So that existing built environment is something that we all need to look closely at, especially for thinking about keeping some of these buildings on the site or keeping the roads that are on the site, because that'll start to dictate things. And in particular, I mentioned the buildings in the middle here, the chapel building here. That's at the heart of the site here. So what happens with that building that has the tallest feature on the site, the most iconic feature on the site? Does that stay? Does that go? How does that play into the alternatives? And what also has been documented is about 10 years or so ago, the town had done an assessment looking at the quality of the buildings that are out there. What is the current status? Are they falling down? Are they doing okay? What state of repair or disrepair are they in? So these next series of slides were actually very telling to us. The items that are in the yellow here are the ones that are in the good shape here. When you look at the number of the buildings that are in good shape, there's not that many that are out there. When you advance on to the next category, which was fair, all of the buildings in the blue show up in a fair condition, which is kind of telling. 10 years ago, remind you of what the condition was found then. When you go on to the next series about poor, you'll realize that a lot of buildings are in pretty tough shape that are out there today. And the next category is that there are some buildings in this color that's showed up there in the green, that they're non-contributing building, which means when the state has taken a look at these so far as historic and resource culture and resource quality, are they really contributing to that as a resource or not? And those are the ones that are not contributing to the history of the site. And then lastly, the ones that show up in white here are the buildings that have already been torn down. So some of these buildings don't even exist this way. So the takeaway for us is that if all of them were pristine in condition, that would be one thing, but there's a whole mixed bag of where the starting point is for the alternatives, and real challenges and issues about how some of these buildings really might be able to survive or not. So how do those buildings really play into alternatives, given the quality and given the assessment that's already been dictated 10 years ago? So switch hatch again, and you think about the site from a transportation and a connectivity perspective. So you can imagine 100 years ago, there probably was not a lot of development around the site. These hospital sites typically are in remote areas. What's unique about this one is up on the hill, as probably many of you know. That's probably why the water tower is up on the hill right next door to the site here, because it's on the highland. But it affords great views towards the river, it affords great views off to the distance, but it also means about access and connectivity given where its location is. And I mentioned it's not really close to the downtown. So think about development in the future How do you get access in and out of this site? How do you get access to Route 27, to downtown, Hospital Road? How do you navigate to and from this site? And who are the users of this site in the future? That should be part of your conversations. And then if you think about, the infrastructure that's there today, I was struck by the picture in the bottom left where there's these great roads that have the mature trees on the site there today that you don't get in sometimes new development. So how might some of those roads that are on the site start to hint at some land use patterns and alternatives, whether you keep the buildings or whether you don't? There might be something to be learned from that as well. So I guess the point here is, how do you recognize this unique location, the transportation network that's both outside and onside the site as part of those alternatives? We're going to be thinking about that as well. Switching hats again from an infrastructure perspective. So this is probably one of the easier ones, I would argue, but it also ties into the specifics of the site. You can imagine when the site was built, underground utilities, steam lines, and power sources and so forth, those things were all on the site, in the ground, in the roads, tying buildings together. So imagine if you keep the buildings or demolish the buildings, that would kind of tell you where infrastructure has to go. How are you providing new services to potentially new buildings? Might you have to go and have renovation costs that might be different if you close it out and demolish it versus have to repair it or rebuild it? So that underground infrastructure becomes very important. And this idea of energy and capacity, the site served a lot of buildings, over 600,000 square feet of development in the past and more. So what is the next round of development? How much capacity, how much energy demand is going to be on that site, and how are you providing those services with that antiquated system that's on the site there today? So we're going to be thinking about it from that perspective. But I think for tonight's purposes, that's probably one of the ones that would come later in the process. But that's on our minds as well. And from a financial and fiscal perspective, I think part of the conversation tonight is intentionally around economics and about the costs of these, because everything has a cost attached to it, whether you demo buildings, keep buildings, whether the town owns the sites or sell off parts of the site, who knows? There's a cost attached to everything. And the good news here is that there's been some prior work that's been done called the real estate market studies that were done in the past that tell us a little bit about who might want to come here in the future, who might want to put buildings on this site. There's a market out there for some of those uses on the site. And then what we're going to be doing on our team is doing a series of economic impact analysis. As we're doing alternatives, we're going to be coming up with the economics behind them to make sure that we understand the dollars, the cost benefits, and who's paying for what, et cetera. And we also know that the town is actively in the process of doing what's called a housing production plan. So as Randy mentioned, this 40B housing process, well, how might this site achieve some of those goals or not? So understanding some of those housing dynamics are important as well. So from a site design and community character, I don't have pictures for this one, and that's actually intentional because that's really what we're here to talk about with you tonight. What do you want this site to look like in the future? What is the character that might happen on the site so far as its built form, natural form, and so forth? If you just look at the buildings and the land use patterns around the site, everything that's outside of the orange, outside of that yellow areas, you look at the small single-family homes, you look at some of the recreational fields, you look at some of the larger footprints, especially down here towards Lot 3 and the Hinckley property. There's a wide range of scales and character defining buildings and built environments that now is the chance to figure out what that's going to look like on the site as well. So that's an open question mark for us and for you tonight.
preceding was a production of Medfield TV, Community Shows.